Well, you can begin with the, far back as the 1820s when members of the Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw Nation had settled along the Verdigris River in the 1820s along with their enslaved Africans. That's the beginning of it. And then the Removal Act was passed in the 1830s. And then for the Creek Nation, the Removal Treaty in 1832, which removed the Creeks and their enslaved Africans to Indian Territory where we are today. So we go into the more the history 100 years ago, or 120 years ago, you get the Tulsa area that was mainly settled by the Perriman families. That would include people who used to be enslaved by them to some of the family members themselves and other Indians. And you get into the allotments periods in the 1880s. 1898 is actually when it started, when the Creek Nation was forced to allot its land out. But in this particular area, in 1901, the Town Site Act was actually passed that set aside 653 acres that were taken from the Muskogee Creek Nation by the federal government because white people who had illegally settled here, who were people from the land runs, from the states, they illegally came here. The Creek Nation wanted them removed. They didn't want to be removed. They ended up lobbying Congress to take the land from the Creek Nation, and they were saying the Creeks wouldn't let them build homes, the Creeks wouldn't let them build schools, the Creeks wouldn't let them put plumbing into their illegal housing. They basically had squatted in the area, and they wouldn't leave. And because of their ability to lobby Congress, when we didn't have the ability to lobby Congress, they succeeded in getting 653 acres from the tribe in an act called the Town Site Act of 1901. It also created Bristow. It created town sites like Wagner. Muskogee was already a town there, but it even set aside more land taken from the Creek Nation. So it wasn't unique to Tulsa, but that's what happened in 1901. In 1902, the Department of Interiors, along with the Creek Nation, hired Gus and Dave Patton to plat the area out, the 653 acres out. The area that we know as Greenwood, that's where Archer and Greenwood is located today. Gus and Dave Patton even plotted that out, but it wasn't called Archer, it was called First Street North. Greenwood Boulevard, however, was named in the plat map in 1902. So even the streets have been given their name, Cincinnati, on and on and on. Why it's called Greenwood Boulevard, that's up to debate. There's no concrete evidence why it was named that other than Gus and Dave Patton were from Greenwood, Arkansas. I've heard black people here say, oh, it's got to be named after Greenwood, Mississippi, on and on, because of the Choctaw chief Greenwood LaFleur, which makes no sense whatsoever, as Greenwood LaFleur was a Choctaw chief who enslaved black people who never came to this area. However, it does make sense that it was called Greenwood Boulevard because Gus and Dave Patton were from Greenwood, Arkansas. So that's the beginnings of it. And then you get into the expansion period. Well, why black people settled that area? Well, we know that in that northeast corner of the township area of Tulsa was a earlier black settlement called Hodges Bends, which was predate Tulsa Township. So that would be where the Oklahoma Eagle area is today. So kind of in that same area, there were black people living as the streets had been plotted out and Tulsa County set on their community. That's an old name. It's antiquated. Most people don't even know it even existed back in that time, in those days. You also had a black community called Renty's Grove, which had a colored school, which is where Jinx is. That was another close black community back in the day that people have forgotten about. Zuma, people have forgotten about that black community, which is 31st and Mingo area. And then you had the allotments that basically happened, where the enslaved Africans who were made tribal members in the Treaty of 1866 in Article 2, The treaty basically ended chattel slavery in the Creek Nation. It made the enslaved African citizens of the tribe. It gave them an equal interest in the land and an equal interest in the tribal funds, as well as the United States and the Creek Nation having to treat them the same as native citizens. So when the allotments came up, where the federal government wanted the tribes to end their tribal governments, and the 5 civilized tribes were then supposed to divide up all of their lands and hand it out equally to each tribal members. That's when the allotment period basically came up. With the Seminole Nation, Cherokee Nation, Creek Nation, all of the allotments were equal. Every tribal member, whether it was a full-blood 100-year-old person, they got 160 acres. Whether it was a 2-month-old freedman baby, Creek freedman baby, that child got 160 acres. In the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation, the racism was a little more thicker. The tribal members that were classified as Indian citizens and intermarried whites got 320 acres, yet the black citizens classified as freedmen only got 40 acres. But in around the Tulsa area where the Creeks are and the Cherokees are, the freedmen did much better, particularly the Creek freedmen. The Creek freedmen received in their allotments combinedly 1,192,240 acres. And most of that was in and around the Arkansas River. And of course, Tulsa is sitting on the Arkansas River. So in the beginnings of Greenwood, you have to realize that the beginning of the area, like the all black towns that were created during the same time period, the reason for their success in those days was because of the land allotments given to black members who were tribal members of the 5 tribes. And if you take a town like Boley and look at Main Street Boley, you have to look at the 100,000 acres around Boley that black people actually own, who happen to be tribal members, that made Boley successful. Greenwood is no different. You have to look at all of the land on the north side of the Arkansas River that was allotted to Creek freedmen, as well as on the south side of the river that was allotted to Creek freedmen. So in the early days of statehood, the creation of Greenwood was based on the wealth, the land wealth that was given to black people who were either black Indians or freedmen, and it was roughly about 300 million acres in eastern Oklahoma that actually created the black towns and communities like Greenwood in early Oklahoma history. But by the time you get to 1920, and you look at the U.S. population census, and you look specifically in the blocks where the people in Greenwood actually live before the 21 Race Massacre, you see that a large majority of the people were in the construction business. Men were masonry people to whatever. They built a lot of the development that was happening from when Greenwood in 1910, not Tulsa in 1910, population was roughly 12,000 people, to in 1920 it was up to 78,000 people. So in a 10-year span, it, sevenfold it grew. So there was a lot of need for housing, for development, on and on. So people came here from the states, black people from the states, in history they're called state Negroes. They came here from the states to look for jobs, and mainly in the construction business, in the oil and gas industry, in the agricultural industry. The freedmen, however, of the 5 tribes, particularly the Creek freedmen, were landowners. They had received 160 acres apiece. So their wealth grew mainly from the agricultural industry and the oil and gas industry, being landowners. And because of the early Jim Crow laws in Oklahoma, where black people could only spend money in black communities, the monies generated off their 160 acres allotment were usually spent in black towns and in black communities like Greenwood. So that's the early story of how Greenwood actually happened. You end up with prominent people in Greenwood that built hotels and had retail shops and movie theaters and all those service industries like that. But that's not what really generated the wealth. What generated the wealth, like in uh, any area, it's always the land ownership around it, particularly back in those days. Some of the myths that we hear in Indian countries, like O.W. Gurley buying 40 acres, uh, we kind of roll our eyes out because that didn't happen. You know, Greenwood itself sits to the Creek Nation to the south and the Cherokee Nation to the north. And the boundaries in modern day, if you want to look at it in modern day, if you look at the bridge, the highway, the 244 that crosses through Greenwood, to the north of that is actually the Cherokee Nation. To the south of that is in the Creek Nation, the 653 acres that was taken from the Creek Nation and plotted out and sold to white immigrants that came here. But to the north of there, of where that highway is, where Mount Vernon Church is, where the Greenwood Cultural Center is located, that's located on a Cherokee Indian allotment named Mary Turley. She was actually married to Jim Turley, or James Turley, the same white developer who developed Turley, Oklahoma, and a lot of the area that's up in North Tulsa. It's she's never talked about. But when you look at the original deeds to like Mount Vernon, for example, which is one of the last properties that have the deed from the original allottee, you'll see that the land was purchased from Mary Turley to the Mount Vernon Church people. So in that area, she was actually the landowner for much of Greenwood that was actually developed, and her husband actually was one of the developers, one of many. Then you have Looney Price, who was a Cherokee Indian, which is much of the area of Greenwood up to Pine Street today. So all of those Cherokee names of Indian citizens are not usually part of the story, but when you look at the early titles of who owned land back at statehood, you're going to find Mary Turley, Looney Price, some Burnett people, on and on. And to the west of that, you're going to actually find Tate Brady's daughter, who was actually a Cherokee citizen, because Tate Brady was a white man who married a Cherokee woman to actually get land up in that area, which was very common back in those days. So, and that also explains something, that it would have been impossible for O.W. Gurley to buy land from the Cherokee Nation prior to statehood because it was illegal. You can only tribal members could do that, and white men couldn't even do it. So they usually would marry Indian women to participate in that. So to say, oh, he bought 40 acres in 1899, and it just wouldn't historically, legally, any of that makes sense. But what he was a great real estate agent, and he probably was the person who was the broker in between a lot of those land dealings. And for some reason, when you see Mary Turley and O.W. Gurley, I could see where the historic confusion have kind of melted through the years of this guy who was a real estate agent, and his name is so similar to Turley, who was the original landowner. The confusion may have happened then. So I encourage any of you guys that are really deep researching the individuals, other than the names of the few names that you hear of prominent people, is to look at the U.S. population census in 1920 and look at the blocks that before 1921, they were there. That you can see what everybody's name was, where they were from, where they immigrated from, if they were from Mississippi, Arkansas, Illinois, New York. It's all listed there on the U.S. population census. And so you can get an idea of who the community were by individual names, because the population census not only named the head of household, it named the kids, it named what they actually did. Matter of fact, in 1920, by then, it was after World War I, if that individual family member was in World War I, there's a little notation there that said he served in World War I. So there's a lot of information on the U.S. population census, 1920, 1910, 1900, that you can look at. And then you can actually look at the Dawes Rolls. and particularly the freedmen section of the Dawes Rolls, and look for other names of people between 1898 and 1906.
Segregation in the state of Oklahoma caused Black businesses to rapidly grow in the Greenwood area. And so we had outstanding Black businessmen such as Ottawa W. Gurley. We had the Williams family, many others who were prosperous businessmen in this area because at the time, $1 would be earned in the Greenwood area and it would turn over 4 or 5 times before it left Greenwood because Black people were not welcome to do business in the white areas of Tulsa. And so they relied on Black grocers, cleaners, doctors. John Hope Franklin's father, Buck C. Franklin, was a lawyer. All these professional and other businessmen relied on themselves and Black patronage to make Greenwood one of the most prosperous areas in the United States. And so many of these prosperous Black businessmen and professionals began to move into the 500 block of North Detroit. And so a sign that you had, as we say today, arrived was the purchase of a nice brick house in this area to even own an automobile. And so John and Luala Williams were the first recorded Black people to own an automobile in Greenwood area. And so there was the many diversions that Black people could engage in. Dreamland Theater. They had the Dunbar and Washington schools, a hospital, 2 newspapers, which were very important to provide information. And this was the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun. 13 churches were located in Greenwood at this time, and 3 fraternal lodges had been built. They also had a library to go along with the educational institution. Barney Cleaver was the first Black to be a policeman to maintain law and order in Greenwood. And so prior to the 1921 Tulsa race riot, Greenwood was a very prosperous area in the Tulsa community.
1921 Tulsa massacre, a race massacre / riot, was the worst in U.S. history. Based on the numbers killed, we know that at least 300 were killed, but we also know that we'll probably not know the exact number, and it's probably much higher than that. The amount of destruction, over 10,000 were left homeless. In 2019, financial terms, about $32 million worth of property, real estate business, and personal property damage. The use of machine guns on the population, and the use of incendiary devices or explosives that were thrown from airplanes. And also the size of the white mob. The intruders into Greenwood numbered between 5,000 and 10,000. The Tulsa race riot, race massacre had features in common with many of the other race riots that were occurring across the country. Most of the riots were assaults on very prosperous Black communities. There was destruction of property, burnings, killings by white mobs. Also, the ignition was usually a Black man, and I put this in quotes, a Black man assaulting a white woman. In the case of Tulsa, the Black man was Dick Rowland, and the white woman was Sarah Page. Interesting enough, in an interview with researcher Ruth Avery, she interviewed the mother of Dick Rowland. Damie Rowland, she indicated that Dick and Sarah knew one another and actually had a relationship. Former President Lyndon Johnson is credited as saying, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice if you're picking his pocket. Actually, he won't notice much of anything, even in terms of being incited to burn, kill, and loot, and if he realizes that that statement is not true. Mark Carlson, who is a special collections librarian at the University of Tulsa, speaks to his research related to historic Greenwood and the events of the 1921 Tulsa massacre.
May 31st, 1921, Dick Rowland had been moved from the police. He had been arrested by the police for the alleged assault on Sarah Page, and they realized very quickly that the police station was not going to be able to house him if in fact there was a mob. And so they moved him to the courthouse, where the sheriff's department had the top floor of the courthouse, and there was a single stairway entry point, so it would actually allow easier control of access. And so they moved him up there. That night, after the Tribune article appeared, a large crowd started gathering, and a large white crowd appeared, just milling about, looking for, I think they were looking for something to set it off. That same time, a group of people from Greenwood decided that the sheriff's department was going to be incapable of defending Dick Rowland if in fact things came to a head. So they armed themselves and went down to the courthouse to offer their services to the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department said that they were not necessary and sent them home. They got about halfway back to Greenwood and decided, no, really, they needed to be there. And so they went back. When they got there, stories are various, but apparently an older gentleman tried to disarm one of the people from Greenwood, and in the scuffle, a shot rang out, and suddenly there was shooting and violence all over the place. This led to a running battle leading away from the courthouse and moving north toward the tracks. Now, at the train station, the defenders from Greenwood managed to establish a defensive line which stopped the people who were coming now armed. They had been looting sporting goods stores, all sorts of things. And they actually all wound up at the tracks, the center of which was at the train station at Boston. And so they started shooting at each other, and by about midnight, things had started to quiet down. The city had closed off access to the trains because the passenger train from St. Louis had come by about 10 or 11, and people from, well, we don't know who, but people were shooting into the train as it was pulling between the two lines of shooters. And so that got away finally safely with minimal injury, but they did stop any other trains from actually coming into the city. So that night, things got quiet, and about midnight, the governor basically told the local National Guard to disarm the rioters. And so the National Guard stepped in and, for whatever reason, chose only to disarm the folks from Greenwood and started taking them into protective custody. That meant that in the morning, when sunlight appeared, there was no one protecting Greenwood. And that's when people started moving in. One of the major areas where there had been a running battle all night was actually on North Detroit and Standpipe Hill. North Detroit had recently become a point of contention between the African American community and the white community because the African American community had moved into North Greenwood, which had previously been white. They broke the color line on North Detroit, and so a lot of the more affluent folks from Greenwood had started moving in and building new houses. So that night, there are stories of people running around on Standpipe Hill all night long, shooting down at Detroit. And by early morning, they had started going in and looting and burning the houses on North Detroit. We have lots of pictures that show this. Although it is not discussed anywhere, at least one of the pictures shows at least an attempt to control the fire initially. That actually stopped fairly quickly, but it's in at least one of the pictures. So they went through and started pulling everything out of the houses they could find, because there were some nice things in there, and then burning down the houses. And from there, they started moving down. Now, there are other stories about what was going on Standpipe Hill. For example, that there was a machine gun on Standpipe Hill that night, or in the morning, shooting down. I don't have pictures of that, so I can't speak to that. But this is what we do know.
Representative Don Ross was the driving force behind the creation of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. The HJR 1035 bill, April 22nd, 1997, established the commission with 11 commissioners from across the state of Oklahoma. John Hope Franklin, son of B.C. Franklin, a lawyer during this race riot, was the most prominent consultant for the commission. The commission was tasked with doing some research that some considered to be controversial. And one of the most controversial areas that we were to investigate and make a recommendation about was reparations. Should the survivors of the race riot be compensated for the suffering and loss that they had to endure all these years? Now, during the actual fighting that occurred on May 31st, the most ferocious fighting occurred at Standpipe Hill. And one of the controversies is that the blacks were actually fighting back against the invaders of their community. And so the story was told to us about Mount Zion, that a defender of Greenwood positioned himself in the belfry of Mount Zion, and from that position was able to shoot down on the invaders. Another story that was told to us was about Peg Leg Taylor, who was considered a hero that night when by himself he was able to hold off dozens of invaders. Now, one of the controversies was this particular event pre-planned? And so when the event was concluded, we can see that there was culpability between the state of Oklahoma, Tulsa County, and the city of Tulsa. And so I want to point out some of the provisions that show this. First of all, the governor of the state of Oklahoma, James Brooks Ayers Robertson, refused to allow the Universal Negro Improvement Association to send its black nurses from Chicago into the state to aid the wounded, sick, and dying as a result of this race war. Another that indicated that the county and the city were involved in this was that city ordinance number 2156 was created to prevent the people who were involved in this from rebuilding Greenwood. And so the ordinance stated that you had to rebuild with bricks, steel, and concrete, which made it nearly impossible for most of the people, such as businessmen like Smitherman and Gurley, to rebuild because they could not get the funds to do it with these materials. Also, the mayor of Tulsa, T.D. Evans, in a statement to the commission, the Tulsa City Commission, said that the riot had been good for the city. But Mary Parrish, in her book, she noted that the riot was not good for the city or its citizens. But one thing that the citizens of Greenwood did learn from the riot was that it didn't matter how much education or lack of education you had. It did not matter how much income or lack of income that you had. It didn't matter how much social status or lack of social status you had. All of the Blacks who lived in Greenwood were treated exactly the same by the invaders.
I want to piggyback on what you said in terms of the premeditation or pre-planning of the massacre or the riot. We not only have some official documents from like the Tulsa City Commission, and those commission minutes very regularly talked about the importance of the Greenwood area and how important it would be to acquire that land. But we also have at least a couple of the survivor accounts that talk about things that would indicate pre-planning. One gentleman who, and of course both of these are deceased at this point, but a gentleman who lived in Washington in his later years mentioned that as a child, as a 12-year-old, he helped unload guns before the riot, to get ready for the riot. So even some residents of North Tulsa knew that it was coming. There's another, well, she's deceased also, but her mother, well, actually, this is the grandmother worked for one of the wealthy white individuals in Tulsa. And 2 or 3 days before the riot, he told them he wanted them to come and stay with him to protect them. And actually, he lived evidently on Reservoir Hill, because she mentioned that her grandmother said they could look down and see the burnings and the gunshots, hear the gunshots from right down on Greenwood. So he knew ahead of time that something was going to occur. So he brought them to his house to protect them rather. We also have the African Blood Brotherhood that mentioned in its newsletter, The Crusader, that they were made aware of the intent to basically destroy Greenwood. One other, I guess, incident that would support this is that in the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, June 1921, it talked about the refugees from Tulsa. And there were about 10 people from the area who made it to New York and were asking for assistance. They mentioned that they had encountered flyers and posters put up that, Black people, and of course they didn't say it in such nice terms, but Black people, leave town or you will regret it. And so they were fleeing what was supposed to be, or what they interpreted to be some type of riot or uprising. So we have evidence that people knew ahead of time that this sort of thing was going to happen. It wasn't just a spark when Dick Rowland supposedly fell over on Sarah Page because of a wobbly elevator. There were and when you think about the fact that there were airplanes used in this, that had to take some planning also. So let me just mention that all of this wasn't included in the commission report. There was Danny Goebel was the main writer and editor of the commission report. I think he did a great job, and he mentioned that there were some theories that indicated there was premeditation, but he didn't include all that. We realize now, I think, I don't know about you, Jimmy, I haven't been a part of too many official commissions, but being a part of this official commission, there's a lot of compromise in terms of what groups will agree on to be in the report. So not all of the information got in the report, but we certainly have some information that there was pre-planning. I do want to mention also in terms of commission recommendations, the reparations for survivors and descendants was the very first recommendation. And other recommendations like a scholarship fund and some more financial support for the Greenwood area. But I do believe in talking to people, I have friends who are descendants of survivors who talk about the fact that they are very upset about the fact that no reparations have been paid. Again, these are people who have lost everything. And as my one friend said, lost her inheritance. There was no opportunity for her family to pass down the wealth that it had acquired. So I think until we justice for the Greenwood survivors and descendants means the payment of reparations, until we get to that point, I'm not sure that we really will be able to close any chapters on this.
Eli Grayson's perspective on how the African Americans were able to acquire land in the Tulsa area, and without his maps and perspective on the land and how it was divided between the Creek and the Cherokees, give us an idea of how it was divided and give us the boundaries on the Greenwood district area. And I really like that part of it.
Land was very important to these early 20th century Black Americans, because land, it was clearly wealth for them at that time, since the majority of them were farmers. But then we have Smitherman and Gurley, who also went beyond just real property as wealth, but also into businesses rather than agriculture. And because Greenwood was so successful, that other sections of Tulsa looked upon them with jealousy and wanted to take advantage for themselves of some of that prosperity. And especially to one of the controversies is to acquire the land in Greenwood to build a new depot for their growing railroad system.
I was very enlightened by Eli's presentation. There's a lot I didn't know in terms of the acquisition of land by African Americans. The other point he brought out, the wealth came not only from land ownership, but also from the surprise of oil. Some of the land contained oil, which certainly magnified their wealth. At one point, I believe it was a young woman, a young African-American woman in Glenpool became the richest person in the world because of land that had oil holdings on it. So that was I thought he did a very good job, and I really was interested in what he had to say. Very enlightening.
Another aspect was, once the Black people moved into the Greenwood area, they immediately started building a community. And it wasn't a transient community where they're just coming in and doing a job for a short period of time and then moving on. They recognized that this is a place of promise and tremendous opportunity. And so they did build buildings and businesses like movie theaters and restaurants and they as the agriculturalists like to say, put down their roots, which meant that they were going to stay. And in the 1921 race war was capable of burning you could say the top of the grass off, but they did not get to the roots. And so when the springtime came, then new grass emerged. And so Greenwood today is, as I said, still rising. It's still growing. I was just there the other day and noticed all the new buildings that are coming up in the Greenwood area.
The commission, you two on the commissions, what happened to the people after 1921? Where did they go? And then how did they come back and revise the Greenwood district? And then how did the building of interstate, the construction of Interstate 244 affect Greenwood district?
Many of them left only briefly to get out of harm's way, but they came right back to rebuild Greenwood. When I think about the courage, the tenacity of the people, the survivors who came back to rebuild, it is just astonishing to me. When we talk about photographs, if you look at the tent city that emerged after the race war, people living through a harsh winter to stay in their particular property area and work to rebuild it. There are many who had to flee, like Smitherman. People who were well known had to actually flee the area, and he, I believe, went eventually to Chicago. But the majority of people tried to come back and rebuild and reclaim what was theirs, and based on just saving money and a lot of cooperation, a lot of support from one another, because as Jimmy mentioned, City of Tulsa turned away not only the nurses, they turned away some of the donations, financial donations to the area. So these people were left completely on their own. So they were astonishing. They were just unbelievable in terms of their desire to regain what was theirs.
We thank you for joining us today, and please look for other events at Tulsa Community College as we engage with our community in discussions such as this one.
We give special thanks to our scholars, Shirley A. Nero, Dr. Vivian Clark Adams, and Jimmy White. We also thank our funders, Tulsa Community College, the Tulsa Community College Foundation, the Oklahoma Humanities, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And certainly, we thank each of you. Please share the knowledge and join us at Tulsa Community College. You belong here. So we want to open it up for a moment for those who are in attendance to have a conversation with the scholars. So if you have questions, there's several that have been placed in the room, but the scholars are going to be with us and we want to let you interact with them for a moment.
I do have a question. Pamela Vickers, to the scholars and to TCC. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My question has to do with the schools. I know Dunbar was there and Booker T. Washington High School, but my mother and father, who are 91, well, my mother, she's 91, she attended Booker T. Washington Elementary. So I was wondering, do you know when the Booker T. Washington Elementary was there? My dad went to Dunbar, but my mother actually attended Booker T. Washington Elementary, which later became Charles S. Johnson Elementary. Over there, you know, right over there where OSU Tulsa is now. And I think that's where, that's where Principal Woods was serving. So do you have a date as to when we had the two schools, Dunbar and Booker T. Washington Elementary, the two elementaries?
I don't. Jimmy, do you have any information on that?
I believe that the elementary school was first, and then they developed the high school, but I don't know the dates on when those schools were established.
Okay,
I was trying to look through something here real quick.
and I do know that the high school was developed later in the
Right.
area that's a little farther north. And is it correct that when the Red Cross came in, they set up their headquarters at Booker T. Washington Elementary in 1921? Is that the picture that I've seen of the Red Cross headquarters? It looks like Booker T. Washington Elementary.
I know
I
it was-
had one person, Lamar Burks, who we were doing research on this project, and I had him trying to find out some information about the schools, particularly Booker T and Booker T Elementary School. And so if you can contact Lamar Burks and try to find him and find out if he actually found the dates. He was working on that project and he never got back with me, but maybe he did find out some information. And if you know him, he's at Booker T. Washington, and he may have that information for you.
Thank you.
And I will add that the Booker T. Washington Elementary School is the one where the American Red Cross, under the leadership of Maurice Willis, that is where they set up the location for the hospital. And so we do know that for sure. And if you go to the OSU Tulsa area where you have the John Hope Franklin Boulevard, there is a memorial that's set up that actually acknowledges the date of that school, Booker T. Washington, as being the place for the hospital.
All right, thank you.
Are there other questions for our scholars? And actually, if the scholars want to add something, this would be a great time to just give a little more information for the audience, and that may stimulate some questions as well.
Are they photos of Booker T. Washington High School for that time also? If that photo, it was a rather large building. So if that photo is the elementary school, are there photos of Booker T. Washington High School?
I think the high school was rebuilt where the historic building is now off of Woodrow. Once they moved away from that building on Easton, it must have been Booker T. Washington Elementary and Booker T. Washington High School, with Carver being the junior high school. And I will ask my parents, they remember those days well. They're 91 and 92. They remember those days well. And then when I attended that building, it was Charles S. Johnson Elementary, and all of it was the elementary school.
So Booker T would have been a high school and elementary school together.
Yes, I think there was that breezeway or something that connected them. And I will ask my parents to clarify that for me. But I'm pretty sure that's what it was. We've talked about it a lot. I'm just forgetting all of the details.
Yeah, this is the challenge of trying to remember things that were destroyed, of course. I do want to add one little small piece here, that just like schools when they were beginning, it started out as an elementary school, and then they would add on grade levels as it was growing. So I do remember it was a smaller school, and then it just kept getting larger.
Right.
Wayne, I did not put my name to the question that I did ask. This is Beverly Ball. And I made a statement, what is rising now does not seem to be Black owned. So how does that profit the African-American community? And I just wanted to know if anyone had any information on that, because it does not look like the African-American community is in control or in charge or will be benefiting from all of the things that are happening in that location now. So does anyone No.
Pastor Beverly, I don't have an answer to that, but I sure would like to add a layer to your very good question. Years ago, my aunt, her name was Rosalind Davis Williams, she opened one of the first shops when they started rebuilding the Greenwood, deep Greenwood area, and it was called Rosalind's Gift Shop. And one evening she told me, I even have it on tape, she said they are going to change the zip code so it won't be identified with North Tulsa. Now, someone please answer Minister Ball's question.
Well, we do know that they basically have gerrymandered and redistrict. The Greenwood area is now part of downtown, as
Wow.
opposed to being a part of North Tulsa. In terms of the businesses on Greenwood, there seems to be a trend to remove the Black business owners, and there are more and more white business owners there. My personal experience is that a friend of mine had opened an exercise, well, actually a dance studio. And what she told me was that, every so often she got a notice, that the rent was going up to the point where she was priced out. So she had to leave her dance studio. And I think that has happened to a number of people. I do know the barbershop is still there and Black owned, but I'm not sure what else really is. There might be a couple more, but it seems to be the trend. And this is what they've done across the country. It's taken over, prominent Black areas. And again, it is becoming increasingly white. I am really concerned that it is no longer a part of North Tulsa, that it has become a part of downtown, which means that downtown will profit from tax money, from tourism dollars, or from whatever else. And North Tulsa will not gain anything from that.
Can I ask this question then? How do we lose that district? I mean, who made that decision to change the district, and why were we? I'm just baffled as to how that was taken and nothing was said or done about it. I don't understand how that. I'm just baffled. I'm sorry. I'm probably sounding like a broken record. But
no, you're right. I haven't been as active in recent years because, I had some health problems and I'm also raising my grandson, but I had some of my former students who've been a part of some groups that have been trying to fight this. There was evidently a group of North Tulsans that fought against this redistricting. Now, I don't really know the details. I don't know what happened so that they were voted or whatever, but I know there was a group trying to fight this. It was not publicized very well.
No.
And I kind of feel like it just kind of slipped under the rug too. But it has, in a way, it's a major blow to the North Tulsa community.
Yes, it is. I do agree, ma'am.
Another aspect of that as well is if you own property in the area, your taxes are going to go up higher based on the real estate that comes up around your property, so that a person who might own a home or other property there could be priced out of their own neighborhood because of what's going on. I don't know how one would protect, or if there were to be a clause that says if you're grandfathered in where you can keep your taxes low. So that's another way of gentrifying a neighborhood, so that the people who live there cannot afford to keep their family home. And then when you think about Tulsa Development Authority, as well as other entities that do what some refer to as urban removal, then there's a very real danger that the African American people who are consistently shown in their earnings, etc., to not have access, the same type of access to earnings or jobs or what have you, then you're going to, in time, it will catch up with them. And that will not be, it'll be a historically Black neighborhood, but it will in fact not be an African American neighborhood because there's no one is honoring the tradition and the historical roots of these families in that area.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So
I know
have
Eli,
oh,
Eli had a question, but I just wanted to say one last thing. The thing that bothers me the most about this redistricting and the fact that those dollars will go to downtown, and especially with the tourist attractions like Greenwood Rising that are being built, the fact of the matter is none of this money is going to the survivors or their descendants. The people who need justice, none of that money is going to them. Tulsa made the cover of the Smithsonian Magazine this month, April issue, and it says Tulsa, I think it says the true story. But one thing the author does is talk about the state of North Tulsa, where we have shorter lifespans, where we have more unemployment, and we have more poverty. And again, here we had the most prosperous Black community in the nation. And because of destruction by a jealous white mob and powers that be, these people, the people in North Tulsa, are not profiting very much at all. And they will not be profiting from the additional dollars that will be made as Greenwood now is part of downtown, and the tourist attractions in Greenwood are part of downtown.
So
thank
does
you.
anyone know if that can be overturned, or if anyone can still speak on behalf of this? Where would we go? Alicia or anyone that may have that answer. Where would we go to turn that around?
I think we need to talk to our commissioner,
Okay,
Vanessa Hall Harper.
okay,
That would be the best suggestion there.
okay. Thank you, Dwayne.
So I do have a question coming from Chief Amusa, who's asking the question about Booker T. Washington. He's asking, why was it not destroyed in the massacre? How was the Tulsa Real Estate Exchange created if Tulsa was under martial law? So those are two questions. The one, why was Booker T. Washington not destroyed? And then how did the real estate exchange occur?
I don't know if we have answers about why it was. Now we can probably speculate why it wasn't in terms of, say, the mentality of the mob. They were looking for property and valuables that they could use, and they, focused on more of the personal property in that respect. But Jimmy, Shirley, I'm just speculating.
Eli, just speak.
Eli has a,
Yeah, I hope your viewers think about not just Greenwood when you're talking about Black land ownership in Tulsa. In 1921, much of South Tulsa was allotted to Black people. It was allotted in 1888. Many of the allotments in South Tulsa were allotted to Black people. Tulsa University sits on 3 Freedmen allotments. Maple Ridge, the wealthy area of Maple Ridge at the time, was sitting on the allotment of Centennial Manuel and her brother Ellis Manuel. We need to think beyond just what the community Main Street was. Around Tulsa, including South Tulsa, East Tulsa, West Tulsa, much of that land was allotted to Black people and was actually basically stolen from them through tax schemes. Ironically, in all the tribes except the Creek Nation, the original allottee, if that person was Black or Indian, were not taxed upon their land, except for the Creek Blacks. Their lands were taxed. And we never look at why their lands were taxed. Their lands were taxed because it was the most valuable area around Tulsa. And if you were a Black family who received an allotment, you had a mother who received 160 acres, a father who received 160 acres. They have 9 kids that received 160 acres apiece. And none of those properties were connected. That's one of the schemes of the Dawes Commission dealing particularly with the freedmen. They made sure their lands were separate. Now imagine you're the parent, you're in Taft, Oklahoma area, or you're in Bowley area living, and yet 2 of your kids' allotments are in Tulsa. And you're told that this 7-year-old child owes property taxes on 160 acres. What's going to happen to that property in Tulsa? The state took it, the county took it. And so land that's been stolen from Black people, particularly in the 5 civilized tribes, have been going on since 1898. And it didn't start in 1821. The dispossession of those lands started with the allotment process. They placed baby allottees in areas specifically where they wanted white schools in Tulsa. The big debate about Lee Elementary School in Maple Ridge changed the name from Robert E. Lee because he was a slaver. No one ever talked about that land that Robert E. Lee Elementary School was built on was allotted to a 2-year-old Black child named Ellis Manuel, who died in 1974. He never got to use that land because before he was 5 years old, it was already taken from him. We look at the what is it called, the gathering place? Say, oh, it was Tuckabuchee allotment. No, it was Ned Tuckabuchee's allotment, who was his half-Black son. And the other half of it belonged to George Tiger, who was a Creek freedman. And none of those people's names ever brought up. Throughout Tulsa, if you look at the land allotments, you'll find that every other square mile was in the land, was in the ownership of Black hands as statehood. And it was picked off. And I know it's important to talk about Greenwood, but it's also important to know, well, what happened to the Black town that was at 41st and Mingo, between 31st and Mingo? Why is that a white community today? Well, the allotment land that made up Oral Roberts University, that one of the allotments belonged to Legis Perryman, but the allotments that make up the rest of the land belong to freedmen.
So what we're going to do, thank you, Eli, for that great information. So what we're going to do is we have maybe about 5 more minutes. And what I'd like to do is have the scholars who are with us, if you just, we're thinking, certainly we will be talking tomorrow about the churches and also about the Black towns. So tomorrow we will start at 1 o'clock promptly. We will, the timing, you will have more time for conversation related to those topics. And if you would like to close us out, the scholars, please, we would appreciate just a word or two from you, and then we will see everyone tomorrow. And thank you very much. I just want to say thank you to Eli, thank you to Dr. Clark Adams and Jimmy and Shirley. You have contributed greatly to our work, and we appreciate you. So just close us out with a last response.
I would just first of all like to thank everybody for participating, and I learn every day. Even though I was on the commission and studied this, I learned every day. And Eli, I really appreciate the points that you're making. And I'm, certainly here in Oklahoma, how we have lost so much land, but it's of course all across the nation. But one of my principal concerns with all of this, again, is the survivors and the descendants. And I'm understanding more and more the magnitude of what they lost or what we lost as a community. And to me, again, justice starts with reparations. And I'm hoping that we will get to that point.
Okay, this is Shirley, and I want to thank all of you for participating and for your input and for the questions and comments that were rolling across the screen. Some of them were lengthy and I could not read them all, but I hope they were saved so that we can go back and look at those questions and look at those comments. They were very much appreciated, and we'll take those in heart. And this will add to our next venture if we get an opportunity to do this again. So I appreciate your input and continue to do that for the next sessions if you join us again tomorrow and the next day. Thank you. Jimmy?
I also want to thank everybody who participated and remember what our ancestors were trying to do. We came out of slavery and we moved westward to try to develop community. And one of the most prosperous in what's now the state of Oklahoma was Greenwood. And several of you were asking, why is Greenwood in the position that it is now, that it seems that it's about to be taken over? And it is unfortunate that 100 years ago, people wanted Greenwood and through extreme violence tried to take it. And now our community is being taken away, not through violence, but through neglect. And so the questions are raised, who can we go to? What can we do? Well, remember our ancestors, they relied on themselves. And so I would suggest that the Tulsa community and the state of Oklahoma Black community rely on itself and take care of these problems themselves.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. We hope to see you tomorrow. This has been a great learning session. And for our needs, please fill out the survey that's been placed in the chat room. We would love to have your feedback to know what we can do better tomorrow and also see how you've benefited from today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.